Everybody, in this podcast or this series of podcasts, I'm going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, which solved the national scandal of chattel slavery. Ultimately, it would be a very significant moment, perhaps the significant moment, ending slavery, although technically slavery wasn't ended in the U.S. until the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, and then of course, ratified by 2/3 of the states. By the way, I don't know if you knew this or not, Mississippi only ratified the 13th Amendment in something like 1995. The reason for that is that once 2/3 of the states had ratified the congressional legislation for the 13th Amendment, it became a constitutional amendment. It doesn't have to be unanimous. But isn't that incredible? Anyway, so the Emancipation Proclamation is a watershed moment ending slavery, although technically slavery wasn't ended until the 13th Amendment. But obviously it doesn't solve American racism, which I think anybody that is aware at all in 2016 knows is still very much a challenge for our society. But nonetheless, let's talk about what I think is the most important moment, the most important act in U.S. history, and that's Lincoln's signing an executive document ending slavery in rebel territory. Okay, so as I've said many times, and as you should know now, early in the war, Lincoln does not want to touch slavery. Even Republicans in Congress don't want to touch slavery. This is what Grimsley calls the conciliatory war period of the Civil War, where Northerners, many of whom think, especially Abraham Lincoln, that Southerners will come back into the Union, you want the war to be fought kind of like a chessboard where civilians aren't involved. Congress goes along with this. I've talked about the importance of Kentucky and Missouri. And the other thing to remember is that there's still a lot of Democrats in the North after Lincoln's election. Now, the Republicans are the dominant party in the North, but the Democrats get almost about 45% of the vote in 1864. And most Democrats, if you're a Democrat by 1861, that means you've been willing to live with the South, because Democrats that couldn't live with the South in the 1850s had left the Union. So Lincoln's got a lot on his plate. The strategic situation, home front morale, his own inclination, his own belief that he didn't have the power early in the war, that the Constitution had protected slavery, which it did, and that he didn't have the power as an executive to end slavery. And then, of course, his belief or his hope that by promising the South that he wasn't going to touch slavery, that Southern whites would regain their senses and come back into the Union relatively peacefully. So what happens? How do we get to the point of emancipation? Well, I've talked about the struggles of the Union Army, which of course are very significant. But let me break it down in a little bit more granular way, but hopefully a way that you find interesting. Now, the first thing that happened is the friction of war. As Union troops move into the South, Virginia especially, they start encountering runaway slaves. And this is very, very important, that slaves played a very, very significant role in their own emancipation. It wasn't like these folks are just waiting for the Union Army to roll into their territory. Slaves, whenever they had a chance, they would run away and come into Union lines. They're very active agents in their own emancipation, as we historians say. They had a role here, they had a vote, and they're one of the factors that's pushing Lincoln. So what happens is that there's a guy by the name of Benjamin Butler, and you don't have to remember his name. He was a political politician from Massachusetts. He goes into Virginia, and slaves start going behind the lines, his lines in Virginia, and they start doing things like cooking and washing and digging dishes. And so what what Butler does very famously, he categorizes these slaves as contraband of war. And if you know anything about the military, contraband of war is an enemy possession that becomes yours. And so what Butler, who's a very smart lawyer, what he does is he reclassifies these slaves. He doesn't set them free, but he calls them contraband of war, which, they're still technically property, right? But what this does, in effect, it gives these folks their freedom. And so during the Civil War, what slaves were often called were contrabands. So Lincoln could live with this. Because Butler isn't exactly challenging the Constitution. He's just recategorizing slave property as contraband, and contraband is property that can be used by an army. So it's a very, very clever designation on Butler's part. It allows him essentially to free slaves without legally freeing slaves, right? Because technically they're contraband of war. Ultimately, almost 250,000 African American ex-slaves will perform labor on behalf of the Union Army, and something just less than 200,000 slave men. Well, it's about 150,000 because about 40,000 freed African Americans fought for the Union Army. So about 150,000 or so ex-slaves fought for the Union Army during the Civil War. So African Americans played a very significant role in the Union victory, both in the Union Army and Navy, but also in assisting the Union Army doing all the kind of chores that needed to be done during wartime. Okay, so this is the first big step, this contraband designation. Now, what happens in Congress is that you have what are called confiscation acts, and you know what, I'm really not going to test you on these. But what happens is that Congress, what they start doing, Republicans in Congress, especially those that are really want what we call the radical Republicans, the ones that want to move very, very quickly on emancipation. And Lincoln was not a radical. In fact, he often fought the radicals during the Civil War. The radicals did not like Lincoln. They thought he was really too moderate, too easy on the white South. To be honest with you, they weren't really that unhappy when he was killed in 1865. The radical Republicans are a complicated lot. They were hardcore. They were sometimes they could be personally unpleasant. But on the other hand, they're the real freedom fighters for African Americans. They're the ones that are really pushing hard for emancipation. And, let's applaud them for what they did, because they're pushing Lincoln very, very hard on the question of emancipation. And if it hadn't been for the radicals, I'm not sure that Lincoln, who was quite moderate on the question of emancipation, I'm not sure how quickly he would have gotten there. So let's give the radical Republicans their due. So what happens is that Congress starts passing confiscation acts. Especially as the war in the East doesn't go too well. In these confiscation acts, what they do is they allow the Union Army to confiscate property of slave owners. Remember, the idea in the classic conciliatory war was don't touch property. But into the summer and fall of 1861, into the winter of 1862, it's becoming clear that this is not going to be a kid glove war, that you can't win the war by not touching the property of the rebellious Southerners, especially slavery. And then in July of 1862, there was a second confiscation act which freed the slaves of everyone that was in rebellion against the government. So if you could be proven to be a rebel, your slaves would be freed. And what's interesting, the second Confiscation Act gets a little bit lost in the shuffle because it's about the same time that Lincoln decides to emancipate the slaves. What I want to get across to you here is that you have a group of radical Republicans pushing towards emancipation, and then even by the summer of 1862, moderate Republicans have become radicalized on the question of emancipation as well. There's a recognition that in order to defeat the South, you have to end slavery. And in the classic example of a moderate who has become radicalized on that question